Chapter 1.7 features yet another new side objective. In a parallel with Chapter 10 of Path of Radiance, the objective is to free several Daein soldiers turned prisoners from a Benyan-run prison. By now, you're probably used to me praising maps for featuring these kinds of side objectives. And indeed, I do think the concept in this chapter is compelling. However, I think the execution this time is quite poor. Before I get into why, I should give this chapter credit for having a fun first couple of turns. There are 3 things that need doing early in this chapter. Going east to recruit Tormod and friends, going north to clear the enemies blocking the exit the prisoners will be using, and going up the stairs to actually reach the prisoners. The enemies are tough as usual, particularly the ones guarding the exit, and figuring out how best to tackle all 3 fronts is an engaging challenge. The big problem with this chapter comes later on reaching the choke point in the northern part of the map. In discussing 1.6.2, I mentioned that it's easy to get choke points wrong, and this is an example of exactly that. This choke point is not only just 1 square wide, it's also 5 squares long, which limits the number of attacks that can be made against the Armor Knight standing in the center of it. And there aren't too many characters in the Dawn Brigade that can deal significant damage to the Armor Knight. In my playthrough, Micaiah was able to exactly one-shot him with support from Soth, but this would of course depend on how she leveled, and she would not have been able to survive a counterattack. Nor can she survive enemy phase against the group of ranged enemies on the far side of the choke point, notably including an archer with a longbow, which makes protecting Micaiah after she attacks difficult. The more straightforward option would be Muarim, but he has a long way to go from his initial location to engage the Armor Knight. There are additional problems with this option as well, which I'll go over a little later. One reasonable response to this criticism would be that it's fine if it takes a couple of turns to clear the Armor Knight with someone like Nolan, or takes a player in enemy phase for someone like Zahark or Soth. The problem is that by the time the player reaches this part of the map, there's nothing else for the entire party to do, as they're all bottlenecked behind this one choke point. The only other route to the right side of the map involves having Soth and Tormod attacking up gaps with hit rates below 50%, and possibly taking lethal damage in the process. Meanwhile, there are 3 prisoners, 1 at the top and 2 in the lower right, that the player can't even start the process of freeing without breaking through the choke point. Not only is this frustrating for a player trying to complete the side objective quickly, it also results in a poorly paced map. Most of the interesting fights occur before reaching the choke point, and up to this point the entire party, or close to it, has something to do. Once the player hits the choke point, half the party or more is standing around with nothing to do. This is exacerbated by the fact that the prisoners are oddly heavy, preventing several units that the player might expect to be able to rescue or shove the prisoners from doing so. This is especially notable in Vika's case given that she has Kanto. Going back to Muarim, the problem with sending him to clear the choke point is that it completely fails to take advantage of his starting location. I don't just mean that he has a long way to go. He and his compatriots enter the map quite close to a group of enemies in prisoner cells that they could start clearing out before the main force even reaches the choke point. In fact, if they could do this, they could conceivably clear the choke point from behind. Unfortunately, there is no way up the gaps on the right side other than having Tormod or Soth get in some lucky hits, as mentioned earlier. Muarim can't clear a path, and frustratingly, neither can Vika. Despite her ability to fly, the railings around the inner courtyard apparently extend to the ceiling, blocking her and Jill from flying across and opening the way for Muarim and others. Bringing all of this together, I think a few simple changes would greatly improve this map. First, let flyers fly over the railings. And second, make the prisoners light enough that Vika can rescue them, and Nolan, Aaron, Soth, and Zahark can at least shove, if not also rescue them. These changes would greatly improve the level's pacing, and would make the arrival of Tormod and company feel more impactful and relevant to completing the map. While the railing change would also enable Jill to fly over the railings, I don't think that would change anything significant about the level's balance. But if it did, it would be easy enough to have a small section with low railings, like those on the staircases, while leaving the rest ceiling height. And both changes would give Vika a chapter where she really feels like a meaningful addition to the party. This isn't exactly a level design consideration, but gameplay and story-wise, she is one of the most irrelevant characters in Radiant Dawn. yet just these 2 tweaks to 1.7 would make her critical to its completion. Overall, 1.7 is effectively half of a fun chapter and half of a dull chapter glued together. I hesitate to call it bad, but it's certainly a disappointment, and well below average for Part 1.